On September 19th, 1988, a 45-year-old black man named Walter McMillan was sentenced to death in Alabama for the murder of Rhonda Morrison. As few as 20 years ago, the primary means of execution in Alabama was a particular electric chair at the Holman Correctional Facility. That chair even had a nickname, which I don't want to say out loud. For the 5 years Walter McMillan was on death row, 7 men were executed, 1 white and 6 black. And because of his cell's proximity to the death chamber, Walter McMillan experienced them all. Walter McMillan was only on death row for 5 years because he was exonerated with the help of a 34-year-old black, Delaware-born, Harvard-educated lawyer named Bryan Stevenson. And Walter's story is told in Bryan's memoir titled Just Mercy, which has since been adapted into a film which I think everyone needs to see. Walter McMillan was exonerated 5 years after being sentenced to death because his lawyer was able to demonstrate that he was falsely accused and his case corrupted by official misconduct. In fact, the Equal Justice Initiative led by Bryan Stevenson has been successful in securing release or reduced sentences for more than 100 people, some like Walter McMillan, wrongly convicted, and others who did commit a crime for which they were sentenced to death, except now they do not have a date and they will not be executed. In our reading this week, a prophet named Micah is standing in a courtroom. That is, Micah is imagining a courtroom scene where at one long desk you have God, and at the other desk you have God's people. And in the opening arguments, God says to God's people, "What are you doing? That is, why are you worshiping other gods?" And God's people respond, "We can fix this. We can come before you with burnt offerings of 1-year-old calves. That is, we can fix this with 1,000 rams or tens of thousands of rivers of oil. That is, we can fix this by bringing to you our most extravagant sacrifices. We can even offer up our firstborn children." Obviously, I want to be careful here, but there have been eras in human history in which human beings with rather good intentions have been willing to exercise violent, arbitrary rituals in order to argue their status before God. We might be living in one of those eras now, ever since the phrase tough on crime was first uttered back in the 1980s. After all, the chair had a nickname. That chair was used in Alabama 24 times between 1983 and 2002. And in those 30 years, the number of black men executed in Alabama outnumbered white men 2 to 1. Trust me, I believe we should hold people accountable. But when one particular gender, racial, and economic group becomes the sole focus of accountability, we have left the hall of justice and entered the lair of the arbitrary, which is the same sort of violence for its own sake that Micah rejects. Perhaps it's no surprise then that the alternative to arbitrary violence proposed by Bryan Stevenson is the same proposal argued by the prophet Micah: mercy. Well, I think Americans are pretty good with the concept of grace. After all, don't we all love free stuff? Mercy is harder because mercy represents what we don't get. For example, when I give our financial secretary $212.75 in loose quarters for laundry love and ask her to wrap them for me, and yet she doesn't yell at me, that's mercy. But when a black man who committed a violent crime is waiting on death row because he is statistically the most likely person to be on death row, then gets his sentence commuted to life in prison, that's just mercy. And maybe that doesn't seem fair. Maybe none of this is very fair. I said it appears to be especially unfair when we're talking about a violent crime, and the incarcerated has committed that violent crime. And there's a grieving family who might favor the death penalty. Yet here's this guy, Micah, or Brian, who is pushing for mercy. I guess I don't know what to say to that, except that I can quote Bryan Stevenson when he says, "Each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done," which happens to be what Imago Dei, created in the image of God, means. And unlike violence, mercy has the power to transform, not just the recipient of that mercy, but the one extending the gift. Maybe that's why Jesus says, "Blessed are the merciful." Walter McMillian was supposed to die, but he didn't, because Bryan Stevenson listened, because Bryan gave him another chance. And if you want to know what mercy, just mercy, looks like out in the wild, that might be it. Which doesn't mean you need to go become a lawyer and commit your life to getting people off death row, but it could mean giving someone another chance at life, especially when that someone isn't like you, and especially when the world tells them they don't deserve it. I know that'll stand up in court. Maybe not in our halls of justice, at least not yet, but absolutely in the kingdom of God. Famously, where the captives are released and the oppressed go free. Because God is judge, and there is mercy enough for us all. And all God's people said, Amen.